Welcome. I'm Anne Torrigiani. I am CEO of the Audience Agency, the national charity for engagement and participation. And I'm delighted to say today, the co-director of the Centre for Cultural Value, who is hosting this amazing event. So I'm also going to say on behalf of the Centre for Cultural Value, I'd like to warmly welcome all of you, and particularly our contributors, to whom very many thanks indeed. And our contributors today are Chris Batsford, who I hope is joining us swiftly from Arts Council Wales in strict alphabetical order, Holly Donner from the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, Hilary Jennings from the Happy Museum, and many other things beside, which can also be said for Harpreet Kaur, who's currently working with Extracts, but also works with many organisations, and Grace Ndiritu, who I believe also works with many organisations as an artist, who'll be talking a little bit about her work. So thank you very much to all of them, but thank you also to all of you who are joining us. I believe we are more than sold out. Delightful to see lots of names coming up that I recognise here. Thanks all very much for joining us. Do please introduce yourself on the chat so we know who's with us today. It's lovely to see you all. And of course, you can join us, as you can see there's the hashtag for Valuing Culture. Please do join in on Twitter as well. Before we dive into the debate, I'm just going to very quickly talk for a moment about the centre itself and how we can be a conduit for all of us to try and work together. So our purpose as a centre is to build a shared understanding of these ideas of cultural value. What difference does taking part in cultural activity make to us as individuals? What difference does it make to society in general? And I think we're particularly interested to take a view about the ways in which we measure and articulate cultural value, which takes account of the many different stakeholder needs involved, takes account of the complexity and richness of the cultural experience, and that our work brings something to do with both rigour and carefully nuanced ideas about how we do research and about evidence itself. So, building a shared understanding about the difference that taking part in cultural activity makes to people's lives. We're funded for 5 years as a research centre initially by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, Arts Council England, and the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. To give everybody many thanks. Most importantly though, how can we benefit you? So you might be thinking about how you can better evaluate your own work. You might be thinking about how you use research and other insights in critical reflection and for your whole organisation or for you as a practitioner. You might be an academic who's interested in connecting with cultural organisations as part of your research. You might be someone making decisions about funding or indeed what gets public recognition. We want to support all of you. And I think, as I say, very importantly, to be a bridge between what have traditionally been quite divided worlds and to sort of allow some conversation between all of us about these really issues that are close to all of our hearts. How are we actually going to do it? Well, we're going to be sharing a lot of research insights through a variety of different mechanisms, but in particular with an emphasis on making it easy to navigate around what is already a very rich body of research. We'll be providing digests which kind of give that overview, lots and lots of free online resources, plenty of debate and discussion, of which this is just the beginning. So do please give us your feedback so we know what it should look like in future. And we won't be doing any research ourselves as such, but we will be funding some research collaborations, in particular prioritising areas where we feel that there are particular gaps in knowledge and understanding. And a really important thing that the Centre will be doing is co-developing with many partners, a set of principles of good evaluation for culture and cultural activity. I want to just briefly mention those because this particular session in the series that we're taking part in at the moment is going to feed into the creation of those principles. So I think I should say that that this is definitely, when I talk about principles, this is definitely not a toolkit. Principles, really, we're thinking about things to think about specifically when it comes to the evaluation of culture and cultural activity. They will be both philosophical and practical, and very much about adopting a wide range of approaches rather than a sort of a narrow thing. And I guess there'll be a particular emphasis on the appropriateness of approach to the matter in hand. So as I say, very much about principles, not toolkits, but very important that we have some, again, this notion of building a shared understanding. So our debate today and the things that you say to us and that our panelists, the ideas that they're both sharing, will feed directly into that. So it's a nice kind of practical outcome for some of the things we've been doing. Right, well, before we dive into the debate together, I should just say, we're very keen that you're joining us for the beginning of this collective endeavour, and we'd very much like you to stay with us. So do, if you're not already on our mailing list and haven't found out about it through that, do please join up. There will be more of these, as I said, so keep giving us the steer. So we'll be talking to our contributors in a moment, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. When I say a little bit, a fair amount of it actually. So if you haven't already, as I say, if you're just joining us now, do please join, say hello and tell us who you are in the chat. I'm going to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just the time being, to keep your cameras off so I can see the panelists. Otherwise, I can't see them responding to me just at the moment. But later on, do please turn your cameras on. Please, join us on Twitter. You've seen the Value in Culture hashtag. Incidentally, practicality here, we have a live transcriber in the session, so please use the CC button to turn on captions in Zoom, or if you prefer, I believe Mikey has just joined the stream text link into the chat, so you can also get some transcription through that method. And I will confirm that, of course, we are recording this session. If you don't want to be seen, keep your camera off and turn your microwave. We won't be doing anything with microwaves. Keep your microphone turned off. The chat, neither the recording, the chat won't be shared publicly, rather, but the recording will be. Although note, we've got some breakout sessions in a little bit, and we won't be recording those. In a moment, we're going to be hearing from our contributors, giving them a little bit of space, and I've got a couple of questions ready up my sleeve that I've been dying to ask them. But after that, we'll be going into a short breakout session, really as a chance for, not quite like in a real conference, sadly, but as a chance for you to get to meet other other participants taking part in this today. We're going to ask you to kind of just give a knee-jerk reaction, a short, sharp reaction to some of the questions that we've been posing, and just to share back some of those ideas with us in the chat so that we can pick that up and weave those into the conversation for later on. There'll be a short break after that. And incidentally, by way of follow-up as well, I just wanted to let you know that we will be sharing names if you gave your permission, if you opted into doing that, so that you'll be able to get in touch with other delegates and participants after the session. So I think I've housekeeped correctly. I'm just checking my list. Yes, if you've got questions, I will keep monitoring the chat. So that's the best place to raise questions. And if your question is blindingly, delightfully interesting, I'm going to come to you and probably ask you to turn your camera on and talk a little bit more to it later on. So at last, to the debate. So we are addressing the delightfully vexed question today of what and who evaluation is for. So why do we evaluate our work, and who do we do it for? Is it to meet the expectations of funders and stakeholders, for ourselves and our own learning, for our colleagues, for those who come after us? Or is it all just a massive waste of time and effort? So it's a very simple question, of course, with oh so very many layers. I guess underlying it are a whole set of other much more complex questions. Whose value are we actually measuring? What power structures and hierarchies are we accounting for, indeed, and validating? Can you actually meaningfully describe, qualify, quantify creativity, an idea, a process, an experience so complex and subjective that describing it only reduces it? So we cry, stop the bean counting. Let's focus on learning, understanding our own practice, the anecdotal, embracing failure in the name of creativity. But isn't it willfully disingenuous to think that we can spend money from the public purse without accounting for it? We wouldn't like it if they did it in hospitals, and why should we be able to do the same thing ourselves? Is it justifiable, especially when there's the public purse is under such stress at the moment, that we belittle this idea of instrumental impacts and KPIs and all that stuff? Should it be the privilege of the creative classes to fail and learn without impact or outcome or use to wider society, or certainly not in ways that we can talk about? To give their own, I'm very glad to say I don't have to answer those questions. I'm simply going to chair them, and I'm going to enjoy doing that very much indeed. I am going to pass on, however, to our panelists today, just to get, they're not going to answer all those questions either, no pressure, but just to get your views a little on some of those questions. So I'd like to invite our guests in the order that we've pre-arranged to give us a 3-minute piece introduction to themselves and to some of their thinking on this subject. So Hilary, from the Happy Museum, as I say, many other organisations as well, would you like to kick off for us, please?
Thank you. Yes, Mikey, could you share my slides. I'm going to go quite big picture in this, so I'll just wait for my slides to appear. Brilliant, thank you very much. So who and what is evaluation for? The dictionary definition of evaluation is a judgment about the amount, number or value of something. So what do we value? At Happy Museum, we value the well-being of people, place and planet first and foremost. Sounds like a no-brainer. But we live in a global system where the primary measurement of societal progress, our collective driver of value, is GDP. And however useful as GDP is, it has crucial flaws. It's predicated on a need for continual growth, so it requires ever-increasing consumption, depletion of resources and huge amounts of waste. Next slide. It can't differentiate between spending on good things like education and culture and terrible things like the money that we need to spend on recovery from accidents or natural disasters. It doesn't measure the economic services that nature provides, such as supplies of fresh water or fresh air, or those that don't come with a market price, such as raising children. As President Robert Kennedy said about GDP back in 1968, it measures everything except that which makes life worthwhile. But meanwhile, this growth as a primary measure of societal progress spills over into measurement of value in the cultural sector. This July, ALVA published its delayed visitor statistics for 2019, showing a leap in footfall of just under 6%. These were greeted wholly positively by the press and sector as a glimpse of normality, tempered by the knowledge that things were going to look very different in 2020. This celebration of growth is accompanied by pressure for increased commercial income from shops, cafes and hires, blockbuster exhibitions, international tourism, and new capital build. Next slide. But merely counting visitor numbers tells us nothing of the quality of their experiences. Since 2011, Happy Museum has worked with the principle Measure What Matters, linking our evaluation directly to what we value, to the well-being of people, place and planet. Our work is underpinned by the story of change, a logical approach which reverse plans from the difference we're hoping to make to what we do and how we do it. This methodology prioritises learning and engages the unexpected and unanticipated, the successful and the unsuccessful. Building on this, we've built a suite of evaluation tools created and tested by our community of practice and available on our website. These include embedded evaluation, narrative and observational evaluation, and our life survey, which measures the impact of museums on people's learning, their interactions with others, their feelings and their relationship with their environment. This year, the limits of our growth-driven systems have been exposed by the global pandemic, limits that will be further tested by the climate and ecological emergency. In systems theory, the two biggest levers to change are to change the goal of the system and to change the paradigm. Maybe now is the time to truly think again about what we value and how we measure it. Final slide. What role might there be for our cultural sector, not only in rethinking and restating our own value, but in helping us move from a system predicated on growth to one predicated on a thriving planet, both now and for the future? Thank you.
Brilliant, Hilary, thank you so much. A very broad frame with quite a specific, kind of activist thinking around what we actually do about it in the middle there. So thank you for setting down the gauntlet there. Right, can I come along to our next speaker? And I think we've agreed that the next person to go next is Holly Donner, who is Director of Strategic Learning, Insight and Influence. Though I said it for you, Holly, because I know you're still struggling to say that in its completion, in a fairly new role at the Paul Hamlyn Foundation, after coming there, after just, many of you all know Holly from New Direction. Interestingly, because I typified that as a poacher turned gamekeeper. I don't know if you think that's fair. I think I'll leave you to introduce yourself in your own way and stop word burbeling on. Anyway, over to you, Holly.
Thank you, Anne. I'm just going to put my timer on so I use my allotted 3 minutes as well as possible. Yeah, I'm going to talk about being the funder perspective, really, because obviously I'm now at Paul Hamlyn Foundation, and I was also at Arts Council England for 10 years, though it was more than 10 years ago, so the dim and distant. But I guess what I wanted to say was, thinking about our question, I think in a sense, it's become a bit of a truism to say that evaluation should not be funder-led. It absolutely should be about learning and reflection and the organisation's process within that. And I think, you know, I would absolutely totally agree with that. But, you know, reflecting on something Anne touched on as well, I think we do have to be pragmatic and understand that as funders, we are thinking all the time about what we're doing, what is the value of what we're doing, what's the impact of what we're doing, etc., etc. So of course, evaluation is part of that. So I think we need to kind of hold that pragmatism. It's not really going to go away. But one of the things I'm really thoughtful about in that relationship between the funder and the organisation is that we mustn't both engage in a form of kind of magical thinking where we're asking for information on impact and outcomes and the organisation is providing it without either party really acknowledging that some of those things might actually be kind of unknowable because of the complexity of really understanding causation. So I think it's just about, you know, not kind of reinforcing the madness that Anne alluded to earlier. Paul Hamlin, we're really interested in how we can address that as a sector in terms of kind of skilling up and getting kind of better at what the different techniques of evaluation and research are. And that's, you know, a core reason why we're supporting the Centre for Cultural Value and other initiatives. And I think within that debate, you know, it's true to say that the nature of impact evaluation particularly is increasingly contested. So I think we need to kind of really kind of acknowledge that. And in some ways, I think the cultural sector has is catching up to that, and we're almost just catching up to impact evaluation, and now we're realizing it's hugely contested. So it's a difficult kind of area. I'm absolutely not advocating for more hard-edged metrics or a focus on attribution, but it's about having a kind of honest reflection on the nature of our evaluation and making sure it's proportionate to the scale of the project and has credibility in its own terms. I think I'd finish by just saying perhaps we should think about more emphasis on process evaluation, iterative models of reviewing and learning as we go, and more attention paid at the start to intention, and less, oh, that's my timer, less about the kind of imagined future. Final thought, I think, is that as funders, therefore, we need to recognise that the reports that we get from organisations are just one tool in how we understand our work in the round, and not to overload them with a kind of mystical importance in that context. Thank you.
Brilliant, Holly, thank you so much. I'm just making a note there. I think I'm going to start using the phrase magical thinking. And I quite like this notion of sort of, yes, the sort of mystical, holy grail kind of thinking around evaluation, and how that is the thing that articulates all. So it just sets rather brilliantly up Chris Batsford from Arts Council Wales, who I think your correct title is Head of Research and Evidence, Chris, isn't it? I think I've got that right. Chris has just come rushing from doing a briefing, I believe, to some politicians somewhere. Is that right? So we won't blame you if you're a bit breathless. Anyway, welcome. I think Holly's done a lovely job of segueing into some thinking around the funder responsibility when it comes to evaluation.
Yeah, and just to reflect on some of the things Holly's touched on there, it's very much important that we aren't just seen as having the evaluation done for us. But in terms of the Arts Council of Wales, we're an arm's length body of Welsh Government, and we're National Lottery distributors. So we have to be accountable and transparent in what we do. And the evaluation of our funding streams goes a long way in helping us to do that. We do heavily rely on some of the quantitative data that we glean from evaluation, but that doesn't really reflect the true story of cultural activity. We need to get into the stories and the learning from activity and projects and the impact on individuals that we can see through our funding. In Wales, we have the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, and that's given us a framework to evaluate against. The Act aims to improve the social, economic and cultural well-being of the nation by placing a duty on public bodies to think in a more sustainable and long-term way. It also puts the onus on public bodies to actually work together and not work in silos. Culture has been identified as one of the 7 goals set out by the Act, which is brilliant. But we can't be naive in thinking that culture just sits in its one little box. You know, culture and arts and health, arts activity will help us reach all 7 goals. So a healthier Wales, a globally responsible Wales. So we've seen a shift in our evaluation methods, both for internal practices within the Arts Council, looking at cultural policy development, but also on a wider scale across the sector in Wales, and the sector is buying into the Wellbeing Future Generations Act. But we can't be seen as it's the parent-child situation. People doing evaluation just for us to prove how accountable we are. Good evaluation should be benefiting all. So one of the biggest issues we find probably as a funder is relying on individuals, organizations to evaluate their work themselves for us. And it can be seen as a burden, if we're honest, whether it's financial burden, time burden, lack of expertise of an individual, or even knowing where to go and ask the right questions on how to evaluate properly. So I feel that we need to develop ways of working that promote the benefits of good evaluation. And if we're totally honest, we ourselves need to be a little bit smarter in the questions we're asking and our expectations of those that we fund.
Fantastic. I'm delighted to say that we're leaping in with plenty of some really good thinking here. I was slightly worried that we were going to further problematize the things that I'd set up, but some really fantastic, some brilliantly rich ideas there to explore in a moment. So fantastic. Thanks, Chris. Can I now come on to Harpreet Kaur, who is a practitioner, a consultant, worked with many, many organisations for years, currently working with Extracts, the wonderful outdoor arts organisation. Harpreet, I think in a sense, you know, when we were talking earlier on, you know, you've got a very concrete, everyday, working alongside organisations view of evaluation. So I'm just wondering how, you know, you're responding to what Chris is saying there. I'm sure there was some chiming, there was some resonance in that, but tell us about your point of view.
Thanks, Anne. So yes, I'm speaking to you today from Manchester. It's lovely to be here. Yeah, and I suppose I want to speak from that experience of being in lots of arts organisations and doing some evaluation as a freelancer as well. And I have to say, I'm going to say what I think a lot of you already know this, but evaluation can often be a dirty word, feel like the dirty word in the office, especially where there's a lot of output and exciting work being delivered and performances and cultural events. It's sometimes a work that nobody wants to do. It can be considered as a bit boring and stale, lots of forms being thrust in the faces of audiences and artists and participants, etc. Sometimes data is being gathered with no real clue of exactly what's going to be done with it, so it might just sit in a pile somewhere. However, when it's done well, I think it can be really powerful. It's extremely resourceful in terms of helping us work out how to be, you know, how to maximize on our outputs and how to meet the needs of our audiences. And it can also lead to change and growth. And again, growth doesn't have to be a dirty word either, because I remember Hilary mentioned it as well. But yeah, so given the world that we're living in and all the challenges we've got with whether it's the pandemic or politics or the environment, I think culture fits very neatly alongside of all of these, is impacted by them and can influence them as well. So I think we'd all agree that we do need change. So I think if we don't step back from delivery and think and reflect on what we're doing, I don't think we're being very clever. So I think there needs to be a bit of a shift in thinking about the word and how we value it. And secondly, I wanted to make a point as somebody that has done evaluations independently. I think, you know, I'd want to say to organisations that they should be less afraid of failure, or at least enabled to be less afraid to fail or admit to when things don't always go to plan, because that's not necessarily failure if things change and go in a different direction. And sometimes what does happen, and I thought the first time this happened to me, I realised speaking to peers that do similar work, that sometimes you'll produce the work, you'll do the interviews and collect the data or whatever, and the client, so the cultural organisation, might not always like what's in there. It doesn't make them feel it might not look good either to funder or whatever it is, and they might change what is in the report, which doesn't always sit well with somebody like myself or the person that has, you know, done the work with a lot of integrity. They may not anymore want their name to that piece of work. So and sometimes we can actually get, you'd be surprised, but independent evaluators can also be bullied into things or questioned on their ability, etc. So I think my advice to evaluators would be to make sure you know what you're diving into, understand what is the framework you're working in, what is the intention, what are the parameters, and also I think organisations need to be accountable to evaluators actually in their integrity and, you know, them being satisfied with their work. And my 3 minutes are up.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. I'm quite interested in this idea of the bullied evaluator. I will say, I'm just looking down the list of who's joining us today. There are quite a lot of people I recognise as being, you know, lifelong serial evaluators, and they may well find that that's a really interesting position. So let's stop bullying the evaluators. Let's come back to that idea in a moment. And finally, Grace. Where are you? I've lost you on my screen. Can I just introduce you to Grace Ndiritu, who is doing, well, I think she's going to talk a little bit about her work, because I think she can probably do it better than I can, but she's doing some amazing work at the moment. And I'm particularly interested, I think we're going to hear about Healing the Museum, some of your work, Grace, but if not, I'll be asking you about it. Right, off you go. I think we've got some pictures. Hooray.
Yes, hello. Yes, thanks for inviting me to this conference, especially as an artist. It's amazing to be able to speak to all this kind of different people. So I'm going to talk about when we ascribe value, how we ascribe value. And for me, what's really interesting is that I think that we ascribe value, basically, it's normally informed by our cultural bias. So what we've been taught to believe that is important. And so for in the West, we believe that status and wealth is important. Whereas in other countries, maybe non-Western cultures, there are still beliefs around that animism and other values are important. And this is when I'm specifically talking about museums that have antiquities. So I've been doing a project called Healing the Museum since 2012. And I began this project because I began to feel that museums were very disconnected with what was going on outside the museum. And I felt that different audiences and different energies need to be brought into the museum, whether that's contemporary or as in the pictures on the screen. This is the Africa Museum in Brussels. So in this project, I've been doing different interventions where I take people on specific meditation or shamanic journeys, always for a purpose, a political purpose. And so for the images that you're seeing, this is a project that I've been doing, the Goethe project, where we go to different European museums to talk about reparations and restitutions. And so for me, this is important because this kind of highlights how our value systems, when we're talking about how we think about audience, how we think about objects, how often we don't think about what are the objects' needs and what do the objects want. So I think later on I'll be talking more about contemporary museums, but for now I think it's interesting to just put that in to your minds, this thought that actually by using different methodologies, by bringing non-rational methodologies, so maybe the opposite of evaluation into museums, we can connect deeper as audiences together, but also with objects. Thank you.
Brilliant, Grace. Thank you so much. You've got me writing a new question I haven't shared with the panel yet. There's something about, does evaluation have to be rational? I think that's a great question to pose to everybody. So please feel free to answer these questions on chat as well, because I'll be looking at those as we go along. So brilliant. Thank you so much, panel. Great thinking. We've got about 10, we've got 5-10 minutes now just to pull together some of those strands. It's very, very notable to me that all of you talked in one way or another about the core of making change happen in your work. And all of you in different ways, it seems to me, are interested in change. And I suppose going back to Hilary, I mean, it does, to ask this first, but I think in a way all of you probably have a view on this. Does evaluation have an important role to play in activism? You know, if you want to make change, does evaluation play an important role? And if so, what is it? Hilary, can I put you on the spot about that?
Yes, I think evaluation has a really key role to play if it's the right kind of evaluation. I think it's because it's learning how change happens. And if you don't understand how change is happening, you can't learn how to make more change and better change. I think one of the things that this is a complete tangent in a way, but when you think about what Extinction Rebellion did, they went back and they looked at how other movements had made change, and they took examples from change in the past and they applied it to what they did. So I think in any activism, understanding the impact of what you're doing is key. So yes.
I think that's an interesting observation, and I think you know, Harpreet, you mentioned that you know, we've called evaluation. It's been magical. It's been dirty. It's been many other things. I think there is a question about how we make evaluation exciting, and I don't know whether there's a sense in which, you know, if we were more able to link the notions of evaluation to change, it might make it a little bit more exciting. I know, Holly, there was something in what you were talking about there as well about how, as a funder, you know, how do we get past this concept of magical thinking? How do we kind of how do we accept the unknowable and encourage organisations to go on a kind of journey? I don't know if you have any other thoughts to add to that.
I mean, I guess I would say that, you know, it's understanding that the limits of what we can know with the methods that we have and the resources that we have and the capacities that we have. So there are things we can know, absolutely, and there is value to collecting data and all the rest of it. I'm very, you know, passionate about that, but there are also limits, and different methods speak to different requirements, and I think it's just you know, it's just kind of holding that in context. I think the whole sort of concept of rationality is really fascinating, and change, because I think that as people who are passionate about data research and evaluation, which I'm sure many of us are, we hold on to rationality and to the idea that you can make a case based on evidence. But actually, the requirements for change, you need to be bringing in emotion and, you know, lots of kind of much less rational ideas. And I think not to fool ourselves that if we just have the best evidence, you know, everyone will be on our side and the change will happen. So it's kind of holding those things in balance for me.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. You mentioned case making there. I'm going to come back, Grace. I might in a moment ask you to talk about a little bit, you know, that question of whether or not evaluation needs to be rational, and perhaps I'd like to ask you about how you'd like your work to be evaluated. I'm going to give you a moment to think about that, just while I talk about case making, because I suppose I'm going to pick up on what Harpreet was just talking about just now. You said something about, you were talking about failure and about people not being afraid to fail. And I suppose actually the question is, are we afraid to fail, or are we afraid to fail in public? Is it the being seen to fail that's the problem? And this issue of case making, you know, that actually an awful lot of our evaluation really boils down to making the case for what we want to do next. So I'm going to ask you, Harpreet, what do you think we should do at the individual organisational level to make people less afraid of failure?
I think the thing is, I think with this, there's different agendas, and you're not going to get away from that. The evaluators supposedly like being objective, and that's what they're trying to do, make in a fair account from the data they're collecting, and hopefully they're using the appropriate methods to do that, or whatever they've been asked to do, or what the budget allows them to do. And I think sometimes the organisation does feel that it really has to meet certain targets because of the funder. But I've realised it's not just about that. Sometimes it's individuals that have their own agenda within an organisation, actually, that want to push something forward. Sometimes they're even pushing their own their profile forward to be surprised. So what I think needs to happen, I mean, I haven't done lots of evaluation projects, but if I was going to do something again in future, what I'd want now is that I wouldn't want to just be have one contact person from the cultural organisation. I want to be brought in early. I want to feel like that I've got access to a team that is related to the project so that I'm safe as well. And then I've got more people to speak to, because then you can sort of get siloed. And I think, I think as an individual independent evaluator, I think it's really important that from the outset, what you're doing isn't just seen as the sort of end.
Yeah,
We need to have better access to the rest of the team. And I have, sometimes you get brought in at the end to share the findings with the steering group, for example. I think we should have been talking to that steering group from the beginning, because that one individual that you're in touch with can kind of become the gatekeeper.
Yeah, so this idea of sort of with not for and probably with not to is quite an important concept. And we tend to think about that in wider areas of our practice, but particularly in evaluation. And that doesn't necessarily stop your independence, is part of the message there. Chris, from a sort of a funder perspective, what do you think that funders need to do to kind of release the fail forward way of thinking, to sort of not be the brake on it, not to be the person, the institution that creates fear?
So a lot of our projects that we fund are self-evaluated by the actual individuals and organizations themselves. I think that fear of failure is at the top of everybody's agenda, because did a piece of work at the end of last year looking at all of our lottery funding and completion reports and read through them all. And every project went well, bar for one. And it was that one project that you could really sit down and buy into, because again, I think it is the organizations that are worrying about their next grant, because if they fail in grant A, what about grant B? We wouldn't go back and fund them. I think that's something that we need to try and promote, is the honesty of evaluation. If you fail, it's part of learning. It is just the learning process, and you won't make that mistake again. So I think that's a message that we should be promoting a lot more, or clearer.
It's a big step change, and I'm sure we're going to come on to that as we're about to move into breakout rooms. But just very quickly, because I set her up a while ago. So Grace, just coming back to what you were saying, and your challenge to us to sort of to leave our rationality in its correct place. How do you like your work to be evaluated? What kind of evaluation works for you as a practitioner?
Well, I think the most important thing is that contemporary practitioners, they're mostly afraid to be pigeonholed and their work, their creativity boxed in. So, because that's kind of how the art market works in visual arts. I mean, it defines people and their careers by gender, race, age, and medium. And out of those things, medium can likely change over time. So practitioners want to be able to grow. I think for most practitioners as well is the endless forms. And I understand that for the Arts Council and different funding bodies, these forms are important, but I've recently had to give a proposal in the format of a video, a 5-minute video where I had to do a proposal. And it was an actually much better way of talking about ideas. So I feel like anything that involves like maybe new forms of media, especially for like younger artists, that we're used to using on social media, that would be a much better and easier way for us to like just do a quick 5-minute video telling you how the project went, if it was an exhibition, what happened, how peers felt about it. And it's much more fluid than having to construct not a false narrative, but like this kind of artificial way of talking so that funding bodies understand. Because that's not natural to creative practitioners. We have to learn how to fit our way of thinking into these forms, whereas the forms should be helping us.
I love that though, that you might actually, particularly with around new work and the sort of, in its very particular fragile place, that you might use the language and currency that is appropriate to, or is the language and currency of that work itself, is a really nice idea. And I think it's suitably creative and challenging to take us into our debate. So now I think, thank you all very much for those. So I told you it wasn't long enough. It is no way long enough. So we'd have to see this as being the beginning of the conversation, guys. Also, do take a look everyone at what's come up in the chat. Lots of interesting stuff stuff there. I'm glad to say you'll get a chance to have a chat with some other people thinking about these things in a moment. So what we'd like you to do now is to have a very brief, and it is super brief, apologies for that, a 12-minute breakout. So what we'd like you to do, you're just going to automatically be put into a breakout room. You probably know how it works in Zoom. We're going to ask you the question, who and what is evaluation for? I think it will come up in the chat so you can see that. And what should we do to make it more useful? Who and what is evaluation for, and what do we do to make it more useful? So we're having a lovely time reading. I haven't managed to get to everybody's comments. Everybody, they're great though. I really do encourage you to read through them. I'm frantically, some people have been very prolific. Helen Palmer, you've written shed loads, that was quick. And as has my lovely colleague Penny, my goodness, lots and lots of things to say. So, right, are we back on? Somebody wave at me. Who can I see? Anne Wishart. Can you hear me? Thank you very much. I can see you. Welcome. Thank you. Okay, so we're back. I was just writing down some notes, some of my favourites. I particularly like less wordy and less boring. So I'm going to attempt to be less wordy and less boring in this last section and give some more space to my colleagues. But what's really interesting in these great comments, and we will be looking at these in detail, as I say, afterwards, and feeding them into the evaluation principles. But I really like, one of the first comments was a brilliant thing that actually is echoed by what a lot of other people have said in the chat here, something around change the language and perhaps talk about, and I think there was an implication there, let's stop talking about evaluation, which sounds very, judgmental, and this sort of notion of, false idea of objectivity from evaluation to learning. And I think that comes through, somebody else talked about rebranding and repositioning evaluation. So a lot of that, really interesting. And the panel, we had our own breakout room, and that was a key thing for us. Another really strong theme coming through, and again, really chiming with us, was by with for, exactly who are our stakeholders, whose value, user-defined concepts of value, but also lots of stuff in here around co-design and collaboration. And I think importantly, working iteratively, so two different but related ideas there. And that's very strong in what lots of people are saying, I believe, here. Quite a lot of stuff about mixed methods, horses for courses, the right way to, that actually it's not all about metrics, but on the other hand, we need a sensible marriage of those things. So it sounds like you had some really different kinds of conversations, but some very strong key themes here. Can I ask, I've lost my panel. I'm going to try and find them again. They're grinning at me. Good, I can see some of them. Can I just check with you guys? Anybody, Holly, Harpreet, Hilary, Chris, Grace, anything you'd like to pick up in those comments that you thought was particularly interesting? Holly.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read them all in detail, and I think it's a brilliant kind of note as an outcome of our session, which is fantastic. But I am struck by the number of comments that do reference the funder dynamic. And obviously we've sort of talked about that, and Chris and I have talked about that, but I think it's interesting just how kind of present that is in people's minds and in their thinking. And I guess that's sort of telling me that there's quite a lot more to be done there. Though I would say that, not all funders are the same, and expectations are very different across different funders. And the expectation for, a £10,000 grant for X, Y, and Z compared to a £1 million core funding every year, I think we have to acknowledge that there's going to be a kind of spectrum there. But I'm noting that, and it's important.
Yeah, and I'm seeing, and there's again, I didn't catch everybody's names because I was whizzing so quickly. But a question of proportionality, which I think is a super important issue, straightforward enough that this idea of sort of percentages is complete nonsense, but actually proportionate to the task. And again, that sort of sense that it's difficult always to know. I think that there are several places suggesting that we need a framework, or to give people confidence. And I think Chris, I know you were talking about that. In fact, you mentioned in your very brief nip through some of your ideas, you talked about how challenging it is, particularly for small companies. Why, if you're a brilliant artist and you're great at making work, why would you also be brilliantly expert at evaluation, or even knowing how to commission it? So I don't know, thinking about a sort of a funder future where things are a bit different, what might you, any thoughts on how we can deal with scale and the scaling of that kind of work?
yeah, budget and capacity is clearly a issue, and it's been said in some of the comments already in the chat. I think there's an element of learning that we could probably promote around evaluation, helping individuals understand what we need, but what also could help themselves in their practice. So it's not just that evaluation, just to tick a box, fill out the form, and I'll get my money. It's all about the learning, and I think that's definitely something that I probably need to go away from today and take with me and think about seriously over the next couple of weeks, months.
But something we were definitely talking about in our group, and in the panel group, was this idea of working at a more collaborative level, and so that's also within, you know, lots of comments here about working collaboratively with your colleagues. But I think also the idea that we might collaborate at sort of a place level, or you know, across organisations, to sort of share skills, ideas of, you know, consultative background, consultative frameworks and so on. I don't know if anybody would like to talk to that. I think I don't have a, I can see hands if anyone would like to, participants would like to comment on that. I was just looking here. I don't know, I see Jan Ford, you were just talking about the tendency to focus on evaluation outcomes rather than process. Jan, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all.
Was I? Oh, okay. Yeah. Just to kind of, yeah. But there is, isn't there? There's lots of words, lots of talk about learning, whatever, and often because the evaluation is often seen as something you do rushed at the end and not integral to the entire process. If you're not evaluating, as I think it's Diandra said about the project management cycle, should have evaluation embedded in it. So as an organisation, we are trying and we're working towards looking at evaluating the entire process, as well as looking at the kind of meta evaluation of the outcomes. Whereas many organisations are just obsessed with, we have to report on the outcomes that we've put in our project, in our funding application. How are we going to do that? But if you have a process where it evolves, then surely reporting on those outcomes at the end should be a lot easier.
Yeah, and I think that was.
Do you know what I mean? I'll shut up.
I don't know if I've got some weird feedback going on here. I think I seem to be on two different. Apologies. Hope you can't hear it. I think this was a theme that the panel were quite keen on as well, wasn't it? The sort of that actually, if we could incentivise and build expectation of iterative evaluation rather than kind of it's all about the outcomes. I don't know if you would like to comment. There's a couple of very interesting comments here that I'm just going to try and formulate some questions into. But that question of should we fund learning over outcomes, I don't know if any of the panel would like to comment on that. I can see you all. Hilary?
I could answer. I think that funding learning is not necessarily the answer. I think that actually, for example, like in film, there are different types of funding that you need at different types of stages in a project. So research, development, and then maybe project outcomes. So like in film, pre-production, production, and post-production. And so I think then the idea of having different types of evaluation at the different stages might be more natural. If that's the goal, you know, because you might need, you know, maybe in pre-production, it's really just about what kind of conversations that you have with different types of people. You know, and then the production, it's not so much about like whether you have the outcome because you're in the process of making the thing. Whereas after you've made the thing, then it's post-production. And then, yeah, then you can evaluate, you know, through audience and let's say peer evaluation to do with the event or the exhibition or something. But I think different types of evaluation at different stages might be better.
Yeah, absolutely. I think horses for courses. Hilary, were you going to comment on that as well?
Well, it was a slight tangent, but I was going back to the question of proportionality, because I think proportionality is really important in terms of context. So there's a real drive towards new and shiny projects, and then when they're, once they've been evaluated, they're kind of put to one side for another new and shiny project. And I think this idea of what is successful and what is valuable in a different context, I think the proportionality of the context is really important. And I also wanted to pick up on the comment by Chris Greenwood in the chat, where he talks about, I presume it's a he, maybe a she, where she talks about what values are we speaking to, and perhaps we ought to start with what is valued by those people who are setting up the project, what their values are and what they value, and so that proportionality is important as well when we're starting to think about evaluation.
Yeah, Chris, I don't know if you're I can't see on the screen, but I don't know if you want to, it's actually a very well articulated and quite long point, but I don't know if you'd like to speak to that at all.
I can hear you, Anne, yes. Yeah, I run a global arts project. It's everywhere. It's dealing with artists and arts organisations all over the place, and all with very different belief systems and cultures, subcultures, and so on. And that's the richness of humanity. None of us want to leave that behind, I'm sure. So on that basis, I wanted in our little breakout to have a widening of the discussion. And I put some ideas in there about, thinking of the different indigenous issues that we know, most of us, I think some of us know at least, exist in places like Canada, in North America, South America, in fact, on every continent. But, if you think of all the Native American, indigenous, Indian issues in North America, if you think of the indigenous Aboriginal people in Australia, and we can go on with that. So it's a very rich world with lots of different belief systems, but that word rational, which came in at the beginning, is a very white, I'm sorry if you don't see it that way, but it is a very white originated word, originating in Europe in the 18th century particularly, and it hides within it, unless you're aware of it, it hides within it all kinds of things. So when somebody earlier said we need to look at in terms of the magical thinking, I got very excited. When somebody else said we need to look at the unconventional stuff, I got excited again, because in fact that is what the world is like. And we don't want to pin ourselves down. We're artists, we're about art, we're about culture, and that is always about change, or the resistance to change. It's always speaking to those two things, one way or another. So that was the thinking behind, widening the conversation. Because in fact, if you look at our society in Britain and most other developed societies, we have all that variety of thinking, that variety of belief systems and subcultures within us. We have West Indian communities, all sorts of communities.
Absolutely, I have to say it is the question that I'm most reeling with. I think is that question about whether or not evaluation has to be, it is inherently rational and has to be. And I quite like this idea of logic models and so on, that we're quite and I think this is a really interesting, rich territory for us to question, which does take us into this question that we've been very interested in as a panel around. Subjective ideas of value and how you do that as an evaluator. Harpreet, I believe you had your hands up earlier on and I missed it.
Harpreet, I was going to say, I was just going to also highlight Chris's comment, and I also liked, forgive me, I'm not sure who it was now, but somebody said something about evaluating evaluation that caught my eye, because we also talked about that in our panel discussion group, and before that they put anti-racist, which also clicked with me. And I realised we hadn't talked a lot about what Chris has been talking about in terms of diversity, and to what extent does the identity even of the evaluator or the organisation influence outcomes, or who you're kind of reaching, who are you actually speaking to, who are you leaving out in terms of inclusion and equality. So I think that's important as well. Like, do your findings and the outcomes really reflect the true society that's out there? I think we need to remember that. So I think that's something that we need to keep on doing, looking at the processes. And I think Grace and others have mentioned that as well. Like, what are the different tools and the methods that we're using? If we keep using the same things, are they actually the right processes and methods to gather information? Question mark.
Yeah,
I'm sure there's lots of research and studies on that. I haven't read them.
Holly.
Can I, just come in really quickly on that? I just think it's such an important point. I think there's a really powerful sort of paradigm in terms of how we do research generally, how we do evaluation in general, how we design these processes. I think there's a very interesting unpacking of the power dynamics, that sit around the kind of techniques that we've developed over the years, and where power is situated within them. And it goes right back to what Hilary started talking about, I think, at the beginning, which is, who defines what is valued is a very powerful position to be in the whole sort of value structure, isn't it? And if that is done through a particular lens, then that's potentially really problematic. So I think we could do a whole session just on that. I think it's a really, really interesting subject.
And connects us with, with Grace's original comments, absolutely. So there's some interesting themes emerging here, aren't there? Particularly around the idea of repositioning a different language around evaluation. Also, the notion of expanding the ways what we're willing to expanding the kind of range of stakeholders and people that we're willing to whose notions of value we're willing to include, or we should be including, rather, not willing to, asking ourselves about why we are and why we aren't willing to do things. Can I just come on to, I'm also seeing there's some very interesting things here with some other comments and ways of thinking about evaluation. People have used the word, Belinda's talking here about the therapeutic value of evaluation, which is sort of a counterpoint, I think, to some of this. Somebody mentioned earlier on, we talked about why were people scared of failure. Actually, sometimes, you're just exhausted, and the idea of having to say after something, things didn't work, we feel very uncomfortable about those kinds of ideas. So these different, quite emotive responses we have to evaluation are coming out. I see a comment from Ben as our director here, talking about how, which I think is a really important point. Ben, I don't know if you want to just join us as a director of the Centre for Cultural Value, whether you rather keep there in the background, but in the setup of the centre, lots of conversations, not just with the centre funders, but with other funders about their role and how it needs to change. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Ben, or not really.
Yeah, hi, just really quickly. I love this idea of magical thinking and of kind of irrational evaluation. It's really exciting. And one of our challenges as a centre is to excite people about evaluation. And I think this event is certainly hopefully helping to do that. But I wondered, what, say, DCMS and certain of our arts councils might think about the less rational approaches to evaluation. Is there a lot of work to be done in terms of getting funders and policymakers on board with alternative approaches? I kind of wondered what the panel and other people might think about that.
Sorry, can you say that again for us slightly more loudly, because you went a little bit quiet right at the end?
Yeah, I wondered what challenges we face in getting funders and policymakers on board with less rational approaches to evaluation.
Yeah. And more something that comes out of the original Cultural Value project, acknowledging that you need multi-dimensional forms of evaluation if you want to really get to some of those, both the knowns and the unknowns, and the sort of three-dimensional understanding of value, which again is very much echoed through the comments. I see Liz Forberg, who's a funder in Canada here, has just suggested that, again, very much echoing those things that we're hearing from funders everywhere, sitting on masses and masses of data, but we need to start walking the talk. So I don't know, feel free, those of you who are funders, to either put your hand up, tell me in the chat that you'd like to say something, or add some comments to that. And I don't want to put all the pressure on I will do. All right, if you're going to take it, Holly, it's fine, go for it.
Can I just say one thing, which I feel I should clarify, which is when I was talking about magical thinking earlier, I was very much
a bad thing.
Engage in magical thinking, because by which I meant that we shouldn't be kind of fantasizing about, what we can say and what we can't say. But I certainly think that when we're talking about art and culture, we shouldn't let go of the magic, and I think that's really important. And I'm going to think about this rationality question, because I'm certainly not ready to let go of it at this absolute moment in time, but I think it's fascinating.
It's a layer. It's not necessarily. I think it is. Well, we tend to polarize a little bit as well. I mean, it might not be either or. It might be both, mightn't it? Right? And it's that sort of notion of the appropriateness of something for what we're doing. Rachel Maguire asked the very apposite question: are we having to evaluate the impact of Centre for Cultural Value, and how does that feel? And I'll tell you that we are. And we got the brief the other day, and we were a little bit like, oh, we didn't write this brief. So there was a degree of feeling our own medicine. You will be glad to know, and I think it will be very transparent. You'll be able to read all about it. But yes, thank you for that question. Can I just yes, a really interesting question there about the challenges. I don't know if I can put to those of you, the rest of the panel, those of you who aren't necessarily funders, Grace, Hopri, Hilary, any thoughts about actually as people have all been funded, what would you like to see funders doing so that they are in fact walking the talk?
I wouldn't mind if the funders funded some of what we talked about, which is different processes and methods of evaluating and encouraging us to use some of those potentially.
I like it, yes. The evaluations are also too boring for the funders. So general theme, if we could, so back to less wordy and less boring as a way, we might all be a bit more exciting. So there is something about repositioning evaluation as exciting, interesting and genuinely useful. So yes, I was going to say, it is nice to say that actually in the evaluation of the Centre for Cultural Value itself, I mean, I think there is something about us trying to model what we're talking about, but working in a much more iterative way. And I think this idea that we have evaluation practices which encourage innovation, that are about, that acknowledge the unknown, the learning about things you didn't know you could learn about, as well as kind of, this sort of possibility of moving backwards and forwards, working in small packages rather than sort of totally end outcomes as being the everything there. Oh, great, very long and very interesting comment from Marge here, which I haven't got time to fully read. I'm going to digest it in a moment, just because I'm going to come on now. We've got 10 minutes left, and I'm going to ask our panel and those of you who are engaging with the chat, perhaps you can think about this as well. I've got a final question really, which is our chance to sum up some, if not all, of the thinking we've had so far, which is about, one of those magic wand questions. So I'm going to ask the panelists, and as I say, do join in the chat, folks, as well. So here's the question. If you had a magic wand, what single thing would you do to enable evaluation to do its job better? So if I can come on here and invite panel, I can see you all if you'd like to wave. Who would like to tackle that first? What would you do with your magic wand? Hilary?
It's been mentioned a few times, but I think we need a different word. There's a George Lakoff, who studies linguistics, talks about the power. We can forget the power of words and our understanding of them to influence what actually happens. And when I went to the definition, it talks about measurement and judgment. And if we could maybe lose the word and find something that better describes an exploration, because that has an open-ended sense to it, and it has an exploratory sense to it, and that feels to me, it even takes in learning as well. So it's not just about learning; it's about exploring change. So I'd like to argue for a different word.
Different word, loving that. There's a strong lobby for a different word here, folks. Yes, so I like it. Thank you. Who's next?
I can go next. Yeah, I'm happy to go next, because I'm really going to just repeat what I already said, which is I wish that there was just more money to fund more research so that we can do more creative and interesting and innovative evaluation that is inclusive, that is representative and is diverse, and that we can keep, the world's always changing, so we're never going to get it right. We have to keep experimenting and having these kind of conversations. So I know money is not the complete answer, but there needs to be that will and desire to be a bit more, to think a bit like Chris and be a lot more globally minded about this.
Globally minded, brilliant. I think that's another really key theme. Thank you so much, fantastic. There's some more comments coming in, again, really in favour of very participatory methods, but working in a participatory way to set concepts of value. Great, thank you. Now then, Holly, Chris, Grace, who's going next?
Yeah, I could go next. I think
Magic wand.
Yeah, magic wand, well, yes, that's a complicated question. I mean, for me, I'd already kind of answered when I was talking about these different types of evaluation, like video format evaluation. But I think what's interesting as well is how, for me, to talk to different stakeholders, especially within museums. So it's not just the source communities where the objects came from, you know, it's also the diaspora of where the objects are now. And so, for example, in Canada, the Museum of Anthropology, they do a great job working with the First Nation groups that live there and inviting them into the museum to do closed research, behind the doors research, whereas also public events. And I did a project there, and yeah, it's really interesting to see how you need not only the people who are looking after the objects now, let's say in the West, to talk about how to work with the objects and participation, but also where the objects came from, you know, because this is an important key, because this is how we're talking about history and forming art history and culture in bigger terms.
Absolutely. So again, that theme of context is everything, and a sort of plural, you know, being able to adopt plural ideas of contextualization in the way that we work. Again, this sort of multi-dimensional thing, but being completely aware that is very important, that we understand what frames we're working through, and perhaps be able to accept more than one in the way that we work. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Chris, Holly, what would you do with your magic wand? Giving up now. You said it all.
I'm loving the idea of these creative evaluation methods and innovative, rational, irrational responses. Ideally, for me, the best way of evaluation and best model would benefit all parties. So funders, we probably need to be a little bit more flexible in what we're expecting, but the evaluation should help the individuals, organizations, as well as the audience as well. We need to take into consideration possible audience members and their feelings in terms of the work and the projects that are being provided to them. So yeah, a nice little model that would benefit all would be ideal.
I like that a lot, and actually we did talk quite a lot about our responsibility to the public, and you know that their sense that they have value within all of that. And so the idea of well, you've said two things there, both sort of you've asked for a really magic thing, a model that fits all things, but also suggesting that flexibility. So perhaps a bit more flex. Maybe there's a sort of iteration between getting a bit more flexible and having a few models rather than just one model in there. It could be a really interesting way forward. Yeah, great, thank you. And Holly, I think that means you get the last word. You get the last wand.
Amazing. Well, I think so much has been said. I will try not to repeat anything. I think it's really hard to know what one thing, but I think something for me around the space for that reflection about intention that happens at the beginning of the process, and maybe within that we can therefore think hard about the stakeholders and the co-creation and the people, and you know, so often we just jump into it, don't we? And then we try and reflect back at some sort of midpoint or end point. Actually, I think the intentionality in the beginning is really crucial, and that maybe that could be catalytic.
So another big idea there, intentionality, and I think that relates to sort of these ideas of purpose, doesn't it? Actually, when you have a strong sense of purpose, some of those issues of boring and wordy kind of go away. If you have, and that takes us back to that thing we were talking about right from the outset. You know, if we see evaluation as being a medium of change, things can change a little bit more in the way that we're thinking about them. Brilliant. Well, listen, I think we've got some nice, we're definitely swapping out evaluation as a word here, I'm delighted to say, and we've got lots of fantastic suggestions. I'm delighted to say that lots of your comments and thoughts we are going to take forward, and you will see them reflected, I hope, in the principles. So can I just say thank you to all our panelists and to all of you to joining in with that really, really fascinating debate. It's only left me wanting more, I have to say. We've just been talking about how we could continue it. So look out, do go and check out, make sure that you're on that mailing list so that we can keep in touch with you. Incidentally, the chat's going to stay open for another 10 minutes now so that we can capture those comments. As I say, you will also see a link for the evaluation of this event, and there's no irony intended. Of course, it is super important that we get your feedback. I think obviously we're all learning how to make Zoom a meaningful space in which to have conversations. So I can't say it's more than ever important that we do it. So do please fill that in. I believe there is a £50 book voucher for the lucky person who gets drawn out of the hat. Meanwhile, can I just say thank you very much indeed to Grace, Hilary, Chris, Harpreet and Holly. You've been a great panel. Thanks to all of you. Take care and see you all soon in a real place, I hope. Thank you.
Thank you.